Welcome to the CNSV monthly meeting. I am Chris Wilson, the chair of IEEE CNSV. IEEE CNSV is a network of consultants providing consulting services throughout the country, primarily based in the Bay Area and Silicon Valley, but not exclusively. If you're interested in learning more about CNSV or would like to become a member or find a consultant, go to the website that is shown on this page here. CNSV is happy to be sponsoring this evening's presentation. Autonomous driving, anticipating human behavior is the hardest problem. This will be presented by James Gowers of Perceptive Automata. James Gowers leads strategy and business development at Perceptive Automata, a team developing human intuition, AI, for autonomous vehicles so that they can drive safely and smoothly around people. Previously, he helped launch and grow DeepMap, the leading HD mapping and localization service provider for autonomous vehicles. James is deeply interested in the multifaceted aspects of autonomous driving and AI, including their profound economic, environmental, and societal impacts globally. He shares his observations as a speaker, panelist, and on social media. James has 20 years of experience launching, growing, and commercializing innovative high-tech growth companies in fields such as automotive, mobile, and nanotechnology. He holds an MBA from Harvard Business School, received his BSc in England, and was born and raised in Germany. He spends much of his spare time watching, playing, and officiating the beautiful game of soccer. So James, welcome, and I'm going to pass it off to you at this point.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you very much for the introduction and the opportunity to present, of course, and thank you to Brian and Dan for the invite and for lining this up. This is a great pleasure to be able to present here. It's an honor to do this for IEEE. And also a big thank you to everyone who's taking the time to join this session this evening. Of course, I have quite a few visuals and video clips and graphics here in this presentation, so we're going to cover a lot of different things. So hopefully this is going to be worth your time. These are clearly exceptional circumstances. We're all at home because of COVID-19. I very much hope that you and your families are doing well, at least as well as can be expected. I live in Los Altos with my wife and 3 teenagers, and we're spending 24/7 in the same building, which is definitely a completely new experience. So far, so good. I think gaming and social media and streaming content video, right, is definitely helpful. And I have teenagers, not 5-year-olds, so that helps as well. But the one big benefit that my wife and I have sort of observed, reflected on, is the fact that we've just, we're forced to slow down completely. Whereas before we had all these activities lined up, sports events, soccer games, school events, work events, travel here, there, everywhere. Everything was always, active and busy, and social events. But that obviously is sort of all gone away, and it forces us to spend more time at home with our family members, right, our kids, and together. And I think that's actually a good thing. I hope you guys are finding some time to relax and chill out and reflect on that as well, because I sometimes in the past, we were so heavily scheduled. So at least we can take a deep breath right now, and maybe even after COVID-19, we might not go back to that same crazy schedule we had before. Okay, so this talk is going to cover some interesting technology. Of course, it's self-driving technology, and there's going to be a lot of computer science and mechanical issues and physics issues and technology issues that go along with that make it pretty interesting. But I also want to emphasize that we are going to spend quite a bit of time on the human brain as well, right? Because driving is a social task ultimately, and to really deploy in a broad scale, we need to deploy in a human-dominated road environment. And we easily dismiss our human brains, right, for things. We don't even realize how good we are at certain tasks. So I hope that this talk will also remind you or elevate the role and the power of the human brain in our daily lives, and specifically for driving, and how can we, and describe how we can leverage the human brain to solve some of the human behavior prediction challenges for self-driving. Okay, so today's agenda, I have four sections. The first section will jump into a brief history of autonomous driving for context. This will be useful just in general, so you understand what the issues are today, and it helps us contextually as we look to the future. Second section will be about driving, and pointing out that driving is actually a very complex social act, not just a mechanical act, and we'll get to some examples there. And then the third section is about the work we're doing at Perceptive Automata here, the team that that is working on human intuition for machines. We are developing AI that can do what the human brain can do so well, and I'll show you some of that in a minute. And then the fourth section is autonomous vehicles, where next, right? So looking ahead, given COVID-19 and given all the changes in automotive and mobility, and all the recent issues around, consumer perception, where's autonomous driving heading next? So I'll give you guys some thoughts on that. First, before we jump into the next slides, an important disclaimer. So I'm going to show you some publicly available drive recordings featuring some of the AV test vehicles. The only purpose for doing that is to educate and inform. Okay, so I want to be very clear that we are not, or I am not, explicitly or implicitly trying to criticize these companies. I know those teams very well. I know leadership there very well. They're all working very hard to move this technology forward in a safe manner, in a scalable manner. And I'm also not making necessarily any claims about the state of the art at those companies, right? So when I show you a clip, say a Waymo clip from, say, 2018 or 2019, I'm not implying that that clip necessarily represents the state of the art today at Waymo, or the kind of work that the teams might be doing at Waymo. So the clips are just a single specific recording, and I'm using those clips to educate and inform, to illustrate some of the challenges that we're facing and that we're solving. So within that spirit, please sort of keep that in mind, okay? It's very important to me. Okay, so let's jump into a brief history here of autonomous vehicles development. The dream of automated vehicles started 100 years ago. It goes all the way back to the beginning of the introduction of cars and vehicles. And then fiction kept it alive. And this is a very interesting, I like this sort of overview chart that Jan Becker at Apex.ai pulled together. It's accessible on his blog and his website. And I like it because it nicely summarizes in one chart going all the way back to sort of the 1920s, first testing of autonomous vehicles. So here, 1925, for example, a radio-controlled vehicle that was driven around Manhattan, and no human driver, right, steering the vehicle. It was all radio-controlled. And then we've had over the decades, a significant amount of fiction, be it concepts or articles or projections, and also movies and TV series that kept autonomous driving sort of in the forefront of our consciousness, right, in daily life, on and off at least. Knight Rider in the 1980s, probably we're all familiar with that. I was still relatively young at that time, but I remember watching those. It was fascinating. And then just movies here, right, that have shown autonomous vehicles in action. And so the dream is a 100-year-old dream, and stories have kept us close to it and kept this dream alive. Clearly, technology limitations have prevented the actual development of the technology until very recently. So the only thing we had was fiction and dreams and movies. But there came a point, and we'll get to that in a minute, where sort of a convergence of things happened around technology that enabled the really serious development of this technology. So we can look at the development of autonomous driving in a bit of a cyclical sort of curve, and we'll get into some of the details in a minute. But the first stage is sort of 1950s, 60s, all the way to 2000, roughly. A lot of fundamental pioneering research, and one of the earliest and maybe the first critical one was Shaky. This is a robot that was developed between 1966 and 1972 at the AI Center at SRI. And you can see here Brian Burke and Jim Jeffries doing a unveiling of a plaque, IEEE plaque. And Shaky is at the Computer History Museum here in Palo Alto. And very, very important inflection point. Obviously very, very crude in terms of hardware at the time, but very, very influential in terms of the algorithms and the way of thinking about, for example, localization, the way systems can detect objects, the way it can understand and perceive its surroundings, environment, and make decisions. So clearly very crude, but nevertheless very, very seminal and very important. And a lot of the inventions there translated directly to the Mars rovers, right? So this was an important inflection point sort of in the late 60s. And then I would say the next major inflection point was work that was happening in Germany around in the early to mid 80s and late 80s. And I'm going to show you an example. This is Ernst Dickmann's in Germany, and he labeled his effort VAMORS. I'm not going to go into the full pronunciation of what that means, but obviously it's abbreviation, but it's called VAMORS, and you guys can Google it. And here's a clip, very first autonomous driving testing. And again, of course, very limited compute, very limited vision capabilities and camera capabilities. But this is a van that he outfitted in Germany. And you can see the safety driver here, or the engineer, sitting in the passenger seat. You can imagine today that would not be acceptable. Also, no seatbelts at the time. If you remember, if you're old enough, there was a time when nobody wore seatbelts, including for testing. So you can probably imagine how interesting of an experience that was for this engineer. And it's about 45 miles an hour, 45 miles an hour. Not bad at all. You can see the Intel chip there, 8086. 10 of those he used. Obviously, very simple environment, pretty much straight line, at least in this clip, but nevertheless, very interesting. On the left here, the text describes subsequent efforts, and after this van, Ernst Dickmann's built this into Mercedes 500 SELs and drove on highways in Germany and France. So that was early work. Again, obviously very limited compute at the time. And then the next sort of big inflection point arguably was the use of first neural networks in the early to mid 90s at CMU. And Dean Pomerleau and Todd Jochem then drove what they called a NavLab 5 autonomous minivan across the country from Pittsburgh to Washington D.C. and then to San Diego. It's actually called No Hands Across America. You guys can Google that as well. And NavLab 5 is the fifth in a series of systems that were developed at CMU with increasing sophistication to develop autonomous driving capabilities and robotics capabilities, autonomous robotics capabilities, starting in the late or mid 80s, and then of course all the way through until the 2000s and beyond. So I'm going to run this. You can note the relatively low compute again available and simple cameras. So I'm going to run this here from the History Channel.
NavLab 5 was a stock minivan, complete with laptop computer and multiple television cameras for front, side, and rear vision. Alvin was replaced by a more sophisticated neural net system, Ralph, which could handle lane changes and heavier traffic. In 1996, Thorpe and his students sent NavLab 5 on the No Hands Across America drive, in which it made its way from Washington, D.C. to California. Ralph did the driving during 98.2% of the trip. The newest NavLabs have reached a point where the distinctions between robot and car have all but disappeared. The computers, radar, and cameras are now virtually undetectable. And that, Chuck Thorpe believes, is the whole point.
Oh, if you take it to show it to my son's sixth grade class, they're disappointed because it doesn't look so impressive. But that's really the idea, that computers are disappearing, the robotic stuff is disappearing. It's more and more of a comfortable environment that just feels like a car, a very smart car that can help you drive, but very much a familiar environment to be driving.
So clearly, even then, right, the claims around technology being mature enough and vanishing sort of into the frame of the car and built into the systems. Clearly, that was the goal at that time already. Very strong claims, of course, being say 98% or 90% ready doesn't mean that you can get to the 99.9999%, of course, that you need for full safe self-driving. But nevertheless, huge inflection point. Very interesting work at CMU pushing autonomous driving forward, and that actually the work there triggered some decisions later that we'll get to in a minute. So we're basically getting to the next stage here, which is out of all that fundamental and pioneering research and the convergence of and sophistication, increasing sophistication and processing power of compute and software, we get to a point now where DARPA steps in. And DARPA, of course, as you probably know, has funded a lot of fundamental technologies like mobile phones and the internet, etc. And so DARPA stepped in and launched what they called grand challenges in 2004, 5, and 7. And that really kickstarted then development efforts at Google from 2009 onwards. And a lot of the teams that worked on these grand challenges, academic research teams, then left the academic environment and over time joined commercial development efforts. And that was a big push or inflection point for the actual commercial development, the applied development of this for the real world. So the bottom left here we have the 2005 winner, Stanley. This is Sebastian Thrun there sitting on the hood. He actually founded or created the Google Self-Driving Group in 2009 with Sergey Brin, of course, the co-founder of Google. Top left here we have Boss, the 2007 winner, that was CMU. And obviously Stanley at the bottom here, 2005 was Stanford. And Chris Urmson worked on the CMU team. And you see him here on the right. So then Google, starting in 2009, used Prius rebuilt or modified Priuses to do initial testing, then switched to the Lexus SUV, and then in 2014-15 introduced a pretty important, bold new concept called Firefly. And we'll get into that in a minute. Obviously here you see Chris Urmson. So that was a big boost, DARPA. Google starts doing its thing. Now, interestingly enough, the actual, more broadly, outside, say, the core research groups or Google, there was a pretty negative sentiment, right? For example, the automotive industry had really no interest in this. And this is a quote from Chris Urmson, who then led the Google self-driving efforts between 2009, 10, and 16. They went to see automotive players, they went to see suppliers, they went to see mobility and transportation companies, and this is a quote from him. Nobody was interested. People were laughing about this. It will never happen, right? So the team went back and continued working on the technology at Google. Here's an example or a quote from Logan Green, one of the co-founders of Lyft, similar to what Chris's experience was. And so we get to a point now where Google basically keeps working on this behind the scenes, despite all that negative feedback. And we get to what I call a sort of a Cambrian explosion, starting around 2015 and then 16 and 17. And what happened was that there was sort of this key inflection point that really sort of kickstarted the this Cambrian explosion. So in 2014, a Google patent was issued. And this patent basically introduced this notion of transport as a service and how to make money off transport as a service, right? Using advertising, for example. You see on the top left, that's a sort of a screen grab of the actual patent, a little bit of background on that. This was in early mid 2014. Google also publicly announced Firefly. That was that bubble car I showed you just now on the other slide for transportation as a service. And very important to note here is that Firefly had no steering wheel, no accelerator, no brake pedals, no mirrors, right? So this was a custom build, just a pod basically, for a self-driving pod for transport as a service type implementations, right? And that was in 2014-15. I'm going to play this. And in fact, in 2015, Google also performed its first fully autonomous drive without a safety driver with actually a blind person. And they did this testing, or they did this test drive in Austin, I believe. So I'm going to run this clip, and then Google also then created Waymo coming out of that in 2015, and everybody's familiar with Waymo today, of course. But let me run this.
We spend so much of our lives driving from place to place.
I'm just gonna stop.
Right here?
Yes! Save us a seat.
Shouldn't it be easier and safer to get where we want to go? Since 2009, our team at Google has been developing fully self-driving technology and testing it on real city streets every single day. Until, after more than 1 million miles, we were ready to take a big step forward. In 2015, we completed the world's first truly driverless ride on public roads. Just a person in a car, no steering wheel, no pedals, navigating everyday traffic.
Well, I've never been in Austin, Texas. Now I'm driving in Austin, Texas. It's a profound experience for me to be alone in the car. A very important segment of my life was cut away when my vision failed, and a self-driving car would give me a huge part of my life back.
This is just the beginning. We're looking ahead new way, a better way for everyone. Say hello to Waymo.
Okay, so that then triggered the Cambrian explosion in many ways, and it actually started with Travis Kalanick at Uber, right? So Travis now, I suspect, suddenly became aware of this fundamental threat that Waymo faced to Uber, right? So if I can launch a fully self-driving robotaxi fleet at, let's say, half the cost of human-driven taxis, then that is a huge threat to the Uber business model. And Travis probably recognized that sometime in 2014 because of all this sort of news coming out of Google. And so he then goes off and basically creates Uber ATG and lures away or poaches roughly, I believe, 50 of the robotics researchers at CMU. So a large chunk, maybe the entire department at the time, and incentivizes them with very, very interesting commercial packages, of course, but also the ability to not just do research on it, but to develop something that can be deployed. This was in 2015. That caused big news at the time. And also Tesla launched its autopilot for the first time in 2015. So it's, big news coming out of Google, then Uber's big investments in autonomous driving and building that up, and Tesla launching autopilot and demonstrating it really kickstarted things in a big way. So Toyota spent $1 billion to build its TRI, Toyota Research Institute. That's Gil Pratt and Mr. Toyota Mr. Gil Pratt on the left and Mr. Toyota on the right. Obviously, they've spent more than $1 billion, but that was the initial commitment in 2015, $1 billion. Then the three German OEMs, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, and or Daimler and Audi, part of Volkswagen, purchased HERE maps from Nokia for $3 billion in 2015, and their publicly stated intent was to own the mapping piece of future autonomous driving or automated driving, and instead of relying on external vendors, they felt that the HD mapping, what's called HD mapping, high definition mapping for automated driving was critical, and they wanted to own that piece. So they went to Nokia and bought what used to be Navtech, and basically bought HERE maps from Nokia for $3 billion. And then also a series of additional deals. Examples here, Uber bought Otto at the time with Anthony Lewandowski. That also led to lawsuits with Google and all the drama around that. You guys can Google that if you're not familiar with that. Ford invested $1 billion in Argo. GM purchased Cruise for $1 billion. And then Samsung bought Harman Industries for $8 billion. ZF bought TRW. Qualcomm tried to buy NXP for about $39 billion at the time, but I think a couple of years ago that deal never happened because of regulatory issues. But it shows you, though, the amount of commitment that went into it. And then I remember this clearly. One really big piece of news that was very credible was Intel purchasing Mobileye for about $15 billion in early 2017. And Mobileye built a tremendous business around ADAS for about 25 years or so before Intel bought them. And they're based in Israel. Amnon Shashua is the co-founder and CEO and CTO. He tremendous success building Mobileye, and they became the leading vision-based supplier of ADAS equipment, cameras, and compute, sensing basically, and compute to OEMs. after for many years initially struggling to get takeoff or to see takeoff in sales, but eventually they became so strong, they're so good at this, and they built up so much know-how and expertise and IP and technology that they're basically the go-to company for ADAS type systems. Now, Mobileye is also developing autonomous driving solutions, so they're not just staying with ADAS, but they're moving into autonomous driving fully as well. And that's the long-term vision that Intel had as well, to be a player in that space. Okay, so if you look at, this is from the Brookings Institution, so if you look at sort of the inflection point here, right? So 2016, things are sort of moving along, trending upwards a little bit, a few $1 billion in mainstream transactions, and suddenly, boom, right? We're all the way at sort of the 75, 80 billion mark in annual transactions. And then the similar dynamics for startup investments, right? So 2016, it really sort of stepped up from a couple hundred million to billions, a couple billion, and that continued for a while. So a big inflection point here around all of this. And by the way, the guys that created Argo, Brian Zaleski and Pete Randa, they came out of the Google team as well. At least Brian did. And then Kyle Vogt and his co-founders, they came out of the DARPA efforts as well. I don't think Kyle worked at Google, but I'm not 100% sure. I don't remember right now. But so basically, the initial DARPA efforts and competitions created all these sort of teams that went off and over time created their own applied development efforts for autonomous driving, right? And then obviously saw major investments and commitments from automotive players. The reason why Ford and GM did that, and I think this is very smart, by the way, they realized that they could not replicate the culture and the talent in-house to solve this problem. So their goal was to say, look, this is so distinct, autonomous driving, in terms of the challenges, the type of people we need, the skills needed, the culture needed. We are going to invest or acquire one of those sort of, I'm going to call this Silicon Valley teams, right? And fund them and help them and support them, but we're not going to interfere or try to build something in-house. And that, I think, is a very smart decision. And my personal view is that probably some of the non-US based OEMs struggled with a decision to do everything in-house. And there's going to be some probably major shifts going on. And in the recent times, by the way, Volkswagen invested in Argo, etc. So they're also following suit. But there's some interesting dynamics going on there. Here's suddenly like an explode. Large companies all working on autonomous driving. These are startups in the US that got funded, focusing on different parts of autonomous, but also more broadly mobility. Here, the European mobility startup landscape, similar. Now, the investment in terms of the dollars committed or euros committed, much lower than in the US, but still a lot of investments here also in mobility startups in Europe and autonomous driving startups specifically. This is an interesting map. I like this one from CBRE, from Matt van der Aai at CBRE. This is Silicon Valley, and he maintains this on a monthly basis. If anybody is interested in a copy of this, ping me, email me, reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to make an introduction to Matt. He can send you a version of this, but I really like this. So this is sort of sort of an auto tech map of Silicon Valley. We have an office here, pretty much in the heart of it. But this grew over the last sort of five years or so, and we have more incoming investments as well in this space still, despite COVID-19. And then suddenly, of course, the automotive companies and automotive leadership and CEOs also realized that this was an existential threat, right? And now we see a rapid and profound transformation from dismissal and ridicule to a matter of urgency, that this is potentially an existential threat, and that this is happening, right? Also 15 and 16. And so then what happened, of course, probably not surprising, a lot of these OEMs, apart from GM and Ford, who invested in Cruise and Argo, a lot of these OEMs suddenly made these big bullish announcements that in 2016 that they're going to have fully autonomous driving solutions by 2020, and that certainly. And there lots of PR activity and marketing activity that was sort of put behind that, and concepts shown at trade shows and CES, etc. And that certainly drove public sentiment and the news cycle, right? Now, the decision to make these sort of aggressive claims clearly, and I remember this clearly, I was very nervous about this when I first started reading these sort of claims and announcements, and I was concerned about hype at the time. And it's probably obvious, right? This would happen. So the reason why they did it, though, is not necessarily because they were completely naive about the technology, but it's really an attempt to create a strong sense of urgency in your large established company, right? So if you're running a huge company like Daimler or Volkswagen or BMW, you need to somehow create a sense of urgency that this isn't just another modification of ADAS or another feature or another model, but you have to create a sense of urgency and commitment that old ways of thinking are not going to work here, right? So, and the way you do that as a leader is to set extremely ambitious goals, but you have to make those public to make them credible. And so that really got things moving at these OEMs, right? So they all started building and expanding their in-house teams. They already had some teams, by the way, before 2015, 16, but they were very sort of niche and very kind of researchy, and they weren't really taken seriously in terms of production level type stuff. But this changed in 2015, 16. But it also drove the hype cycle, right? Here then lots of partnerships that were announced between 15, 16, 17, and 18. And this is just one of those maps. This has changed. This is not necessarily up to date, for us to give you a flavor for suddenly how traditional automotive companies were partnering with Silicon Valley type companies. Or a automotive company would suddenly work closely with a software company. So things evolved very rapidly, and everybody's trying to place bets, right, and create alignment here. So this inevitably then led to hype deflation, right? So in 2018 and 19, because what of course happens is that we make all these big claims, set all these targets, and as these targets move closer, we obviously can't deliver, right, as an industry. It's just too aggressive. What really kickstarted this concern or burst the bubble, so to speak, was a fatal accident in Phoenix, in Arizona. And this is Uber, unfortunately, killed a person who was Elaine Hertzberg, who was walking across the road with her bike. Now, the frustrating thing in many ways, of course, the death is tragic, but the frustrating thing from a technology perspective is that the reasons for this accident actually weren't directly related to autonomous driving technology. It was really a breakdown in procedures, a breakdown in decision making, and decision making driven by cultural issues potentially. So, for example, the systems were sort of dialed down. They were trying to reduce the sensitivity so the car wouldn't be responding or braking too much and hesitating too much. And they were getting ready for some demoing. So there were a lot of issues that led to this that actually weren't necessarily specifically autonomous driving technology related. It was just sort of a consequence, indirect consequence of it. But nevertheless, Obviously, it raised many questions. People were starting to question progress. The public became more skeptical. Regulators became more skeptical. Politicians became more cautious. And here we have the Gartner hype cycle. Gartner published an update to the hype cycle and placed autonomous driving here on the downward slope, heading into the trough of disillusionment. And, you know, in many ways, as Mike Ramsey was sort of pointing out in that article, and more recently, that might actually be a good thing because it removes all this sort of hype and inflated expectations, and we can focus on actually delivering this technology. And then here on the right, you see an article in the Wall Street Journal at the time with, bubbles bursting. And so I think there was sort of a public realization that this technology wasn't going to happen in a matter of a few years, right? So this would take longer. And then also we had a series of consumer surveys that were published, and sort of in summary, 50% of people are very concerned about driving an autonomous vehicle. Now, this is not surprising. This is quite normal for new technology. It's actually a really good sign in a way, and this depends on your perspective, right? It's actually a really good sign that anywhere from, let's say, 30 to 50% of people would actually try and actually take rides in autonomous vehicles. So it depends on if you think the glass is half full or if it's half empty. But for a fundamentally new technology like this that has big safety implications and where you have to overcome your fear of a loss of control, the fact that a very large number of consumers or people are actually open to it, that's actually a very encouraging sign. And then we always have this sort of early adopter curve, right? Early adopters adopt, and then as the broader public becomes more familiar with it, they also jump in, especially if they're very, very clear. There's clear value that's being delivered. So anyway, but nevertheless, in that environment in 2018 and 19, these kind of results are positioned in a certain way or perceived in a certain way, and generally negative at the time. And here's a quote from Ed Niedermeyer, and he just actually published a blog post on this a couple of weeks ago, and I really liked his summary here, right? So it's that gap between public perception and AV technology reality. And it's if we hadn't gone through this hype cycle between 2016 and 16 and all the way to 19, and we would if we had kept sort of a more of a sober type of understanding of where the technology is and when it can deliver the goods, most likely we would have just sort of seen the improvements and understood the improvements and celebrated those improvements over time that are actually really fundamentally happening. A lot has happened in the last 4 or 5 years at all of these different companies. It's just that all that good news obviously gets buried by all the hype-related issues, right? And that bubble bursting. But I like his quote. Okay, so now hype deflation. So now we're going to and then some of the deployments, the announcements for the deployments were sort of pushed out by a year or two in the last year or so in 2020, 2019. So we're now looking at more sort of like 2021, 2022. Now this is pre-COVID-19, and we'll get into some of the COVID-19 impact a little later in the presentation. Obviously no clue yet what the next down cycle is going to be. Okay, so let's focus on some of the sort of key challenges specifically around driving that we're trying to solve for in this industry. And I just want to remind you guys of the fact that driving is actually a very complex social act as well. But before we do that, here's a very interesting example of tremendous progress with the mechanical aspects, especially of driving, or automated driving. And this is a Waymo. I was driving behind this Waymo car in Mountain View, Los Altos. This is San Antonio, El Camino, and I was waiting here behind this car. I have my dash cam, waiting behind the Waymo. The light is red, And what you're going to see in a minute is the lights turn green, human drivers start driving into the intersection, through the intersection, but the Waymo car obviously has its lights on. And I'm at this point wondering what's going on, right? Is there a breakdown? Is there an issue? Now, if you look on the left, you see this ambulance suddenly, right? Turning up here, appearing on the left. So what actually happened was that this Waymo car was able to detect from a distance the ambulance through auditory signals and visual cues, and then made exactly the right legal decision, which is to stop and wait, because just in case the ambulance wanted to turn left into the intersection and our right ambulance left, and so that the Waymo car wasn't going to block potentially the right of way for the ambulance, right? So obviously the moment the Waymo car realizes the ambulance is through the intersection, it starts driving. But you notice that human drivers just were oblivious to it. You know, we have our smartphones, we're listening to music, we might not quite, detect the ambulance soon enough, we might be distracted talking to a passenger in the car. So a lot of human drivers just simply drove through the intersection, which isn't necessarily safe or smart, right? So this is a really good sign here. Great example of the work that the teams are doing out there, including Waymo, of course. But there are lots of edge cases, right? And driving is not just physics. So here's an example. I was driving in my car, and this is also El Camino near Mountain View. And let me go back here to this. And there's a lady suddenly, I pull up to this intersection. It's also about a year ago. And suddenly I see this SUV here in the distance. There's a lady who gets out, and she suddenly starts to chase something on the road. She steps on the road, doors open, lights turn green, and she waves at the cars. She's trying to get this, whatever this is. Turns out it's a baby raccoon. And so she's trying to save the baby raccoon, which is great. Not a bad thing in principle to help animals, but also extremely unusual, right? So how does an autonomous vehicle deal with this? We as humans know kind of what's going on. We can interpret this. We can adjust accordingly. And she waved as we're driving by. And so while this is the first time in my life, and maybe even your life, that you've experienced this is something we as humans can easily sort of interpret, we can deal with. We can make sense of it well enough to be able to adjust safely to it. You might have seen Chris Urmson's lady, a clip where there's a lady in a wheelchair in the middle of the road chasing a duck with a broom. That they recorded that as they were doing their sort of Google self-driving development. And when I saw this, I was thinking, well, this is my lady in a wheelchair with a broom chasing a duck moment. Maybe not quite, but pretty close. And here's another example of the complexity of social driving. So this here is the Arc de Triomphe, the roundabout around the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. There are no traffic signs, no traffic signals, there are no cops, there are no lane markings. This is completely organic, social, right? There's certain ways of interacting, eye contact, sort of a social contract implicitly. You're edging forward, you brake, you don't brake, you let the car roll. There's a tremendous amount of signaling that goes on, right? And I could be watching this here for the next 60 minutes, but it's fascinating. But you get the gist, right? So this is impossible for autonomous vehicles, but there are no rules here. This is all human-to-human interaction in the way driving happens. So keep that in mind. This is a big challenge, right, that we need to solve for. So here's an example of a Waymo car trying to merge on a busy highway, merge left into the lane. You can see the indicator going. And, human drivers are sort of merging right and leaving gaps. Not big gaps, but, probably you and I would be willing to squeeze in there. For example, that gap here between those two cars would be sufficient. We would squeeze in, and human drivers, slow down a little bit and let us in, no issues. But obviously for the Waymo car at the time, it was a little too challenging, right? So again, there's a lot of social interaction going on when we do merging in busy situations. It's not just about the physics, right? How, I'm going to merge if the gap is X. It's really about understanding what humans are trying to do. If you can sense a slowdown, if you can sense sort of somebody waving, or you see somebody waving, or you can see the eye contact through the mirrors, humans know what's going to happen next and how to navigate that, right? We take that for granted. Here's a similar example. This is a recording.
I don't know if it was because of the parked cars, yes or no?
In Germany.
And now it stops, and that guy thinks, hey, you let him pass. Think, what the hell? Okay. That was interesting.
Right. So this is an example of a Tesla recording. This is from a couple months ago in Germany. This is with the Autopilot 3.0. And I'm going to run this again. And I'm going to.
I don't know if it was because of the parked cars, yes or no?
Mute this here. Whoop, let me go back. Pardon me. So this is a Tesla car.
I don't know if it was because of the parked cars, yes or no?
And
now it stops. And
pulls up, it stops, right, because it can do object detection. So it slows down. So what happens is this, again, this is human, this is the social contract of driving, right? So the Tesla's approaching the situation. It is at a certain pace that it's slowing down a little bit because of that car in the middle of the road. The slowdown signals to the driver on the right, who has no right of way, that the driver in the Tesla, or the Tesla, is trying to signal that he's going to let that car cross in front of him. So those are subtle cues, right, that we as humans pick up on. So the human driver here on the right assumed that the slowdown was to enable him to cross as a friendly gesture, right? So the Tesla slows down even more. I'm not doing too well with this clip, but let me go back here. So the Tesla slows down even more, right? Because it's a delayed response. Then the car takes that as a signal, or the human driver takes that as a signal to go, and then drives, right? Again, this is a human interaction, right? Very, very subtle. But then, of course, the Tesla doesn't see that, or doesn't understand that, and then it tries to accelerate again, right? Which causes frustration for the other driver, and it's also embarrassing for the human driver in the Tesla, right? Again, just a very simple example here. By the way, Tesla's doing a tremendous job, amazing cars, amazing pioneering work the company's doing. So again, I'm not dissing Tesla at all. I just want to point out there's certain issues, right, that everybody's working on, looking to solve. And then, frankly, there's the tech crowd, or Silicon Valley crowd, and teams working on this, and very, very early excited adopters that are extremely forgiving and tolerant. But the average person won't be that tolerant. So this is a quote I came across randomly on Reddit. And there's some pretty strong feelings about this, right, in day-to-day life. So yes, driving a Tesla is exciting the first time. Yes, seeing the Google Firefly bubble car drive around in Mountain View and Los Altos is interesting, exciting for the first week or two. But I remember even I got frustrated, being stuck behind one of those, because it was, I believe it was only able to drive 25 miles an hour. It was sort of following speed limits. It was very cautious, and it becomes pretty frustrating in day-to-day life for many people. And there's going to be a lot of negative responses to this kind of driving behavior as the technology rolls out. If the technology can't drive in a confident and natural way in a human-driven road environment, right? So here's an example of another Waymo example. Downtown Mountain View on Castro Street from about 18 months ago, maybe 2 years ago. And you're going to see, I'm going to pause it. So you see two pedestrians standing here at the edge of the road, right? So there's a crosswalk here, there's a light, traffic light. And these two ladies are chit-chatting. They are certainly interested in crossing eventually, right? We would all agree, but they're chit-chatting. They have no interest in crossing right now. And the Waymo car is just behind them, and it pulls up, and it's trying to make sense of this situation. And you'll see what happens. chit-chatting. The Waymo car hesitates, it tries to move, and finally it does. Again, let's go back to the beginning. Two ladies chit-chatting. The Waymo car is hesitating, figuring out what to do. I'm not sure if the safety driver took over, or if the car had eventually decided to go because they have some built-in timeout maybe period. But it was trying to see, basically it was able to see it knows there's a crosswalk, it can read the traffic lights, it can clearly locate the pedestrians, but absent motion or any other cues, it doesn't really know what these pedestrians are trying to do. And we'll get into some of that in a minute, some of that information, some of that details there in a minute. Here's another example talk in the Midwest. They posted this publicly. You can see that this pedestrian has no intention to cross. He's even stepping backwards, but every time the vehicle detects movement, so motion cues, including the arm moving, right? So it suddenly brakes, it stops, and it brakes again. So it's relying on motion cues. It knows there's a crosswalk, it knows the pedestrian's there, but the moment it sees forward motion cues with the arm, it stops, right? That is, imagine doing this kind of driving in Boston or Pittsburgh or wherever, right? In day-to-day life. This would be very frustrating for human drivers that are driving around this car, but also passengers in this sort of robotaxi. Again, not trying to diss the talk guys, doing a great job, but just an example of a moment. Hopefully it illustrates some of the challenges everybody's looking to solve. Here's another quote, and again, if you read carefully, there's a lot of social interaction and communication going on between human drivers and, say, pedestrians, right? And human drivers know that the pedestrians are not suicidal, even though they're already moving into the lane or into the road. You can see that they're waiting for the car to go by first. But autonomous vehicles just see human objects or humans sort of moving, motion-based cues, moving into the road, and really the only option it has is to slam on the brakes. It just doesn't understand enough about those dynamics. Now, I'm not saying that necessarily an autonomous car should keep driving, right, under all circumstances, but the point here is there's a lot of interaction going on. Now, just imagine if you're a human driver behind this AV, and you also see those individuals, these pedestrians, doing what they're doing, and you, in that moment, as you're looking at this scene unfold, you also predict, they just want this, they're not going to cross, they want the car to continue driving. And suddenly the AV in front of you slams on the brakes, and you don't anticipate that because that's not what you anticipated looking at the scene, right? It's very easy to slam into the back of the AV. Now, technically, you as a human driver are at fault, but nevertheless, imagine if this happens too often. There's going to be a big sort of public backlash, right? If this happens too often. In fact, rear endings and side swipes make up about 85 to 90% of accidents with AVs because AVs are not driving predictably enough for human drivers. Here's an example, a mobile example. This is something they posted publicly during the last CES a couple months ago. So let me show you what this looks like. So at the top here, you're going to see, so this is the car approaching a roundabout. You'll see in a minute pedestrians highlighted in red. So it can detect the pedestrians, of course, right? So you see we're approaching. So right now it highlights this car in red, right? Because the car clearly has right of way, which means and it's entering the path. So the AV, the mobile IAV, should not be proceeding. It needs to be cautious. It's also highlighting pedestrians here next to the crosswalk, right? So it's approaching the crosswalk, and it's basically coming to a complete stop. The pedestrians are right now hidden here underneath these trees. But you can see everything else is fine, so it's halting and stopping because it sees these two pedestrians next to the crosswalk. And absent any further information, right, you don't really know what to make of this. You have pedestrians at the edge of the crosswalk, and you have to basically come to a stop. And then after a while, you either decide just by default to go, or the safety driver accelerates, right? When a human driver looking at the same situation wouldn't be driving. So here's the view through the front windscreen, and we did some creative screen grabbing here to show you this. So you see approaching these same two pedestrians. They're clearly chit-chatting, right? They're talking to each other. They have no immediate intention of crossing. And again, a very difficult situation for AVs to deal with if you only have motion and physics to go on and context. For humans, this is very easy. We can just glance at them and make sense of it. Here's an example of from Voyage. Oliver Cameron and the team and Drew are doing great work at Voyage, rolling out autonomous driving technology right now in retirement communities. This is something I grabbed. Again, they posted this publicly. You see how there's this individual here on the bottom right. He is tending to his trailer. He's looking for something, getting something. Clearly to us, no intention to cross or interfere with the path of the car, but very difficult for the AV to really fully comprehend, right? So what it sees basically are the motion cues. It's the individual, the location and motion, and the context. It can see that there is a human being in the middle of the road trying to do something, and I'm not doing too well with my my clips. Walking into the road, then walking back, the car stops, doesn't know what to make of it, and now notice that he steps onto the edge of the side of the road, if you look at the top right, and he stops, and he actually then, to basically let the car go, almost like he knows why the car is stopping, and then he steps back in just to pick up a hose or a cable or something, and just the fact that, again, the motion vectors pointing into the road makes the Voyage car brake and stop again. Right, so let's go back to this. He stops, picks something up, and the car brakes again. So I need to show this again. I'm gonna bear with me here as I do this. Right, so again, he just steps, he makes a step, and the car brakes again. So these are very difficult situations to navigate. For humans, extremely easy, but very difficult for autonomous systems. And some quotes here from Gil Pratt at TRI, Chris Urmson and Brian Zaleski, just to substantiate the claims I'm making, that anticipating human behavior is probably one of maybe the hardest problems for automated driving, and it needs to be solved for. You can't just go out there with just a mechanical system that works on physics only. You need to complete all of the insights, right, to really have broad scale deployment and drive properly in a human dominated road environment. Okay, so let's get into the work that we're doing at Perceptive Automata and how we're solving for this problem. So this is how automated vehicles see the world, right? So it's bounding boxes. The systems can detect traffic signs, lane markings. It can distinguish between vehicles and cyclists and pedestrians. So pedestrians here in yellow, cyclists in red, cars and other vehicles in purple. You see the lane markings detected. It has a HD map. It has autonomous systems have a very, very good, solid understanding of the physics of the world, right? The mechanics of things. So when they approach a situation like the ones I've showed you before in the previous clips, let's say they see this crosswalk. They know there's a crosswalk here because they have real-time perception and they have a HD map. They can see the sign and they see a pedestrian. And what they see, remember from the previous slide, they see basically a bounding box. So the pedestrian is a box and they track the box. And the bounding box now, a pedestrian sign next to the crosswalk. And the only option you have really is to stop here, right? Absent further information, context, location, zero motion, everything is telling you I have to stop. This is a pedestrian who wants to cross. But the moment I show you this image of the actual pedestrian, your human brain has determined in about 200 milliseconds that this individual has no intention to cross, although he's near a crosswalk, near a sign that says there's a crosswalk. There's something about his body language. He's leaning back a little bit. He's got, his shoulder is relaxed. He's looking at a phone. His shoulders are down. There's something about his posture, right? And his sort of social cues that he's giving off that tell us he has no intention to cross. And so we as human drivers would keep driving. In fact, driving behind an AV here, if this was the AV and we're driving behind the AV, we would not expect the AV to stop and brake here, right? So this is another simple example of incomplete information if you're just looking at the world through motion and physics and things like that. And Chris Urmson refers to some of the challenges in this space as sort of the golden hammer problem, right? And the golden hammer problem is not new conceptually, of course. It's if you have a hammer, everything is a nail, right? So you keep looking for nails and you just use the hammer to hammer in nails all over the place. And the problem is, of course, it reduces the way you think about and narrows the way you think about the world and about how you can solve certain problems. And so the AV industry typically is comprised of computer scientists and software engineers, electrical engineers, etc. So it's a very mechanical sort of skill set, and the way of thinking is very computer science and engineering driven, right? Which is great because it solves a lot of problems, but it also might give you blinders, right, to how to solve certain problems. And the three sort of golden hammer approaches used today to solve this sort of human behavior prediction challenge are really insufficient because they simplify the world, which is important in many ways, right? If you're a computer scientist or engineer, you want to simplify a challenge or a real world problem to then be more easily able to turn that into code and be able to at least solve part of the puzzle, even if you can't solve all of it. And this is what the early pioneers did as well, right? They had to come up with ways of bootstrapping, given their low compute and availability and all the limitations they had around sensing. They had to find a way to kind of hack it or make it work, right? Given the conditions there. So simplification is principally a good way of thinking about it, right? So you focus on the essence to solve a problem. The problem is, in this particular case, when it comes to human behavior, simplifying the world strips them of predictive power, right? And the three sort of golden hammer approaches are typically motion cues, contextual cues, and sort of pose modeling, where we try to simplify the human body. And so here's an example of how let's take the first one. So let's take motion-based predictions, right? So typically Kalman filters type predictions are made. You'll see up here, this is our work we did at Perceptive internally. You'll see an individual approaching here in the distance. He's approaching a crosswalk. And you can see this blue, this is Kalman filter prediction about his likely path, right, based on prior motion. And I'm just going to dial this back a little bit here. You'll see the blue bubble on the top right here appearing as he walks into close to the crosswalk. And so the motion cues are clearly pointing forward. They're pointing in the direction of the crosswalk. This is clearly telling us he wants to cross, so we come to a complete stop. But when you actually notice here that when he comes to a complete stop, the Kalman filter predictions are useless, right? We can't make any motion-based predictions anymore at this moment because we have no motion. It's like those two ladies standing next to the crosswalk chit-chatting, right? Zero motion. So you have nothing to go on. Now, the next step, of course, is you use context. You say, oh, well, he's in X location at or near a crosswalk, so I should come to a complete stop. Now, in this case, that might turn out to be the right decision, of course, but there are many cases where that's not the right decision. But if you just isolate motion prediction techniques and you strip away, say, the crosswalk here, at this moment, there's zero motion, right? It's very difficult to use motion to make predictions about what he wants to do next if you just use motion cues. I'm just, again, using this as an educational clip You see our signals, by the way, in the bottom left there, but we'll get into that in a minute. Here's an example of, let's use context. Let's try to use contextual learning. So if I drive a certain road environment 1,000 times, 10,000 times, 1,000,000 times, I'm going to learn some general rules about how the different sort of agents are going to behave in that road environment, be it vehicles or pedestrians or cyclists, etc. Right? So let's take a look at this example here. So we're approaching this roundabout. There is a individual pedestrian standing close to the crosswalk. You can see as we're approaching, and I need to figure out how to do my clips better. But you see we're approaching this. Now, if I'm, excuse me for a second here, if I'm driving this road 1,000,000 times, and basically what I see is a pedestrian standing here. Let me just go a little further, near a crosswalk, right? What I'm going to learn in this environment here, in this location, is that as a general rule, pedestrians will want to cross. So when I see a pedestrian near a crosswalk here, this crosswalk, I will come to a complete stop, because that's what I've learned, right? Contextually, I'm learning that this individual wants to cross. Again, zero motion, right? There's no motion cues. For example, he's not moving away from the crosswalk. That would help me figure this out. He's just standing there. Now, for us as humans looking at this, clearly he has no intention to cross. We can pick up those social cues. It's easy for us, effortless, right? But for AVs, very difficult. So AVs, contextually, if you're doing contextual learning, it doesn't help much here, right, in solving this problem. Okay. And here we have another example. This is a jaywalker. So if you look at this lady, right? So again, contextual learning, if you apply contextual learning, you drive this road, 1,000,000 times, 10,000 times, whatever, and you learn, or you can see that there's a taxi stand on the left. You can see that here, lined up. And what you're going to learn is that humans sort of at or near this location are going to be getting in or out of taxis or waiting for taxis. That's what you're going to sort of contextually learn, right? That's sort of your general rule. But clearly we can see, just looking at her, she's not waiting for a taxi or getting in and out of a taxi. Or if she was waiting for a taxi, she would be looking or craning her neck and looking beyond our car. It would be very different body language, but she's clearly looking at us, right? And she clearly wants to cross. So jaywalking example. Again, very difficult for AVs to deal with if you're just using contextual information. Again, she comes to complete stop, zero motion cues here as well. Now you see our signals, by the way, and I'll get to that in a minute, but our signals are indicating a high intent to cross and a high awareness. We get into more details in a minute. So this is an example, again, where context doesn't help much. Here's an example of sort of a simplification using post modeling, right? So it's a stick figure representation of the human body. Remember that image I showed you of the pedestrian standing next to a crosswalk. Here's a stick figure of the same individual. Does this tell you if the pedestrian wants to cross? Yes or no? No, it doesn't, right? Again, it's simplification to enable computational problem solving and computational processes, but it doesn't fundamentally solve the decision-making problem here. It's insufficient, right? So what are some of the alternatives? What could we do to solve this problem? Well, if we forget about the golden hammer for a second and think about a system that can actually do this task exceedingly well, right? And actually we have one, and we all have one. It's called the human brain. So what if we could plug into the human brain? And I'll show you how we at Perceptive are doing that. We're able to plug into the human brain to solve this problem. But let me first remind you of how powerful your human brain is. And this is easy for us to ignore or forget. But if you take all of the world's compute and put that into one pile, all of it, all the supercomputers, every single compute or chip in laptops, it's roughly speaking equivalent to the compute power of one human brain. Now, maybe we've already advanced a little bit beyond one human brain. Maybe if we created that pile and measured it, maybe it's 2 human brains. But when I first learned about this, this was staggering to me. To realize that my human brain is so powerful computationally was sort of very, very surprising. And I think we just need to remind ourselves it's easy for us to forget how powerful the human brain is. And there's a reason why we easily forget. Now, of course, computers optimized for speed and precision, brute force calculations. And our brain is actually optimized for perceptual computing and motor skills and locomotion, things like that, right? So it's a special purpose perceptual supercomputer. About a third or so, 20 to 30% of our brain power goes towards perceptual computing, and we do it constantly, all the time. And we've developed an ability to do this kind of processing at a level that is subconscious. And this is because the brain has evolved over millions of years to become so good at this task, including looking at a pedestrian and making instantaneous, powerful predictions about their intention and being able to read their social cues. Because it's so easy and effortless for us, we've been doing it for millions of years, it's become subconscious, right? So we're not even aware of what we're doing and how powerful this is. And how unique it is. But we need to remind ourselves of this. So that the human brain is the gold standard for this. And one of the ways that we can all relate to, probably, or some of us can, this is my daughter about a year ago doing her driving lessons and driving test. I was obviously very nervous. I wasn't sleeping much at the time. But I noticed that she struggles with the rules of the road, but really has no challenge out of the box, right? Driving and looking at pedestrians and cyclists and making effortless predictions and accurate predictions about their intention. Now, there's some additional things we learn as we start to drive, right, around sort of pedestrian and driver interactions, etc. But fundamentally, it was effortless for her to deal with the much more complex issues around pedestrian behavior, cyclist behavior, human behavior, and social cues in the environment, in the road environment, compared to trying to remember all the rules and passing these tests and all that stuff, right? So this is an example where the perceptual supercomputer comes in. This is another example, right? The moment I showed you this, your brain was able to interpret this very, very complex image, actually. When you take a step back, this is extremely difficult for any machine, any AI to understand properly. We're able to quickly process that, for example, there are mirrors here on the left and the right. These are not real humans, these are reflections. We can see facial expressions, we can see emotions. We can quickly see that this individual here is trying to weigh themselves. We can see Obama's foot here on the scale. We can process this really quickly, and hopefully for many of you, this sort of triggered a smile, probably also nostalgia, so we're going to move on pretty quickly. So this is what an AV would see, right? Bounding boxes around individuals. Would have no way of making sense of this situation. There's no social cues it can pick up on. So the human perceptual supercomputer is effortless at this, and there are a tremendous amount of subtle social cues that we pick up on when we look at pedestrians. For example, these are just some examples. It's not the complete set. And in fact, if I asked you, why do you think that pedestrian wants to cross or not, you wouldn't even be able to tell me what your full list of criteria are that your human brain is using to make that decision, because it's subconscious, but we just know. And so we've developed methods that allow us to extract from images, say 1 million images of pedestrians or cyclists or human drivers. We're able to extract the rich social cues that humans use to make these sorts of predictions. And we're using the tools of behavioral science and neuroscience to do that, right? So we're able to extract from human brains that information indirectly, turn that into training data, and then train our machine learning models and deploy those on autonomous vehicles, and then they can make the same kinds of predictions that humans can make about pedestrians and cyclists. And we're clearly not we're avoiding the golden hammer problem because we're approaching this from a very different sort of perspective, right? From a behavioral science perspective, not computer science perspective. Obviously, we are machine learning experts, we're computer science experts as well. Our co-founders are both behavioral scientists and computer scientists. But fundamentally, the starting point is how can we use the tools of behavioral science to leverage the human's perceptual supercomputer, right? So that we don't have to rebuild that piece. And the specific technique that we're applying is visual psychophysics. It's been used for decades. If you're a behavioral scientist or neuroscientist, you are familiar with this, and we've scaled that, right? And the fundamental problem visual psychophysics solves for is that a lot of the processing is subconscious. So I couldn't ask you to give me, you wouldn't be able to give me the list of factors or criteria you used, right, to say why the pedestrian wants to cross or not. It's subconscious. We simply can't express it. So how do we though get at those cues, those criteria and cues the brain uses indirectly, right? So we have to find a way of doing that, and it's called psychophysics. And we've scaled, specifically scaled psychophysics in our case. And it's really the scientific study between a stimulus, say an image of a pedestrian, and how that's perceived by the human brain, and what the human brain, then what kind of inferences the human brain makes. So it's sort of a indirect way of extracting it, right? So in the high level steps we go through is we show human annotators systematically modified images of pedestrians or cyclists or human drivers. And then we ask them a series of questions, and we manipulate those images in many different ways, and we record their responses to those images. So the modifications that we make could include sort of making an image sort of fuzzy like this, right, more milky, or we blur parts of the image, or we cover parts of an image, like in this case the head or the hands, right? So at a very simple or conceptual level, it gives you a sense for the kinds of things we do. And we run these, what we call experiments at scale. Experiments is probably the wrong word because that sounds very researchy, but at scale, we run these sort of processes and experiments, psychophysics experiments, across a large number of images. And through this sort of manipulation of these images and interaction of the humans with these images, manipulated images, modified images, we are able to then extract indirectly and capture indirectly the cues that humans use, the human brain uses to make these predictions. So it's a very it's a very novel way of solving the problem. Clearly, nobody else that we know of, at least, in globally in this industry, is doing it. And obviously, we've patented these methods. And now the interesting thing is, by the way, after we've built our machine learning models and we run our models now live on pedestrians, we can begin to look at some of the aspects in the image or of the pedestrian movement or behavior and the social cues they're giving off that we as humans use, right? Because our models have learned or are learning what the human brain is using, and now we can look at the models and highlight what they're looking at. So indirectly, we can begin to extract what the human brain is interested in. And here you can see, this lady, she's sort of standing at the edge of the road. She doesn't have an intention right now to cross. She's clearly waiting. Her shoulder is relaxed. She's sort of, leaning back a little bit on her heels, and you can see that the model is highlighting the shoulder area. So it's very relaxed shoulder area. And I'll show you an example a little later where the shoulder plays another role, and we never realized this until we analyzed our models and the way humans look at subtle cues. But turns out the shoulder area is very diagnostic of human intention, and we use that a lot as for social cues for decision making. So we can. It looks a little spooky, but you can see how certain aspects of the image that the model is picking up on. Okay, so now I'm going to show you implementations of what we call our state of mind AI or our models in an actual deployed sense, right? So this is a clip that will show you and walk you through examples where our models are performing outputs in real time and looking at pedestrians and making predictions about their intention awareness. So this is narrated and it has text. So I'm going to let this run for a few minutes. I might pause it to explain certain things, but let's go take it from here.
Technology visualization. Awareness. Does the pedestrian know the car is there? Aware of the car. Not aware of the car. Intention. Does the pedestrian want to cross? Low intent to cross? High intent to cross. Real-time system outputs. This pedestrian is aware of our automated vehicle and clearly intends to cross. Pedestrian motion alone can predict crossing intention in these obvious situations.
So we're using this just as a baseline. If you have motion cues, you can solve for it. But now we get into the extra cases.
However, without pedestrian motion, we have to rely on subtle social cues to predict pedestrian intention. This pedestrian does not want to cross as we approach, so there's no reason to stop. Easy for human drivers, very hard for machines.
So when you might have noticed that she never, by the way, looked at the car specifically, right? And so we're able to capture a much more holistic and complete view of awareness, human awareness, and specifically sort of situational awareness. She clearly knows where she is. Yes, she's looking at her phone, but she knows that she's at the edge of the road and that there's traffic, and she can sense and hear and perceive traffic, right? She doesn't have to look at us for us to be reasonably confident that she's aware of us and traffic. There's some simplified versions of, or trying to solve this problem, right, using the golden hammer approach, use gaze tracking techniques. So they would, similar to pose models, you would be able to identify the head, and they're trying to locate the eyes or detect the eyes. And then if the eyes are basically gazing if the head is gazing in your direction, then the person is aware. If it looks away, if the gaze is in the other direction, then they're not aware. But clearly, human situational awareness is much more sophisticated than that, right? So our models are able to capture that more complete sense of situational awareness. Okay.
Does the pedestrian and clearly intends? This pedestrian does not want to cross as we approach, so there's no reason to stop. Easy for human drivers, very hard for machines. This pedestrian initially drifts to the left with the intention to cross, but changes his mind once he becomes aware of the vehicle's approach.
You can see he turns and he then already shifts and rotates his body.
Our AI correctly signals his change in intention and his ongoing awareness, even though he turns his head away. This construction worker is standing in the road next to a parked car. While most automated vehicles would stop due to limited understanding, our AI correctly signals that this person is aware of our approach and does not intend to cross. The result is smoother and more confident driving, possibly avoiding a rear ending by a human driver. Initially, this pedestrian is aware of the oncoming vehicle and has no intention to cross. However, after he turns onto the side street, our AI correctly signals that he is no longer aware of the vehicle behind him. At this point, the boy becomes aware of the vehicle, and our AI correctly signals his intention to cross, despite backing away from the curb.
Notice his backward motion. If we just use motion, it would be pointing away from the road, right?
Glare often reduces the accuracy of computer vision, but our AI is robust to adverse conditions. It accurately distinguishes the intentions of these closely grouped pedestrians. Subtle social cues signal that the lady on the left wants to cross, while the two boys don't.
So if I asked you why do you think that this lady wants to cross, you'd probably tell me that she's leaning forward a little bit, she's looking, her arm is sort of into the road a little bit, her feet are pointing in a certain direction. Turns out, this is an example of sort of what we're learning about the human brain. It turns out that the shoulder area and the way humans hold bags is diagnostic of intention. So for example, when somebody's just standing there not really wanting to cross, the bag sort of hangs loose relatively, or the arm is sort of resting maybe on the bag a little bit, or relatively relaxed. The moment the intention changes though to wanting to cross and move, the arm tenses and clamps against the bag to prevent it from moving too much, and the shoulder tenses a little bit. And so our models can pick that up, and we as humans can also pick that up. It's actually a very interesting example of what we're learning from our models.
Most automated vehicles would stop after detecting the police officer on the right, possibly frustrating human drivers. However, our AI accurately signals that the officer does not intend to step in front of the vehicle. It also accurately signals that the officer on the left does intend to cross, well before he begins to move.
Okay, so I hope that was useful. I hope you can relate to it using your own sort of human perception and human intuition around these things. And here I'm going to show you, remember the Mobileye example I showed you? We tried to overlay our signals. Now, the issue here is we had to manipulate and do multiple screen recordings and try to get this image blown up and then run it through our models. So big distortions in the image. And also, if you notice, probably for GDPR reasons in Europe, the Mobileye obscures, blurs out the faces, and so that's certainly impacting our models. So you're going to see no awareness signals, but clearly that's because the model can't really deal with the video. But more importantly, what I want to show you is zero intention, right, to cross. So we could have told the Mobileye AV that these individuals have no intention to cross, and then the AV could sort of keep driving. Here's the earlier example, the Voyage example I showed you. See here, our signal is basically telling the Voyage car that there is zero intention to cross. The person has high awareness, they're situationally aware, they know we're approaching, they know there's a road, traffic, no intention to cross, so we can keep driving. And this signal obviously stays low throughout. Right, so again, we could have helped the Voyage car here navigate this. And now, remember there was a second piece. It's the part where he's at the edge of the road. And you can see that when he's at the beginning, let me just go back here. So clearly right now, no intention. Then suddenly there's a change. He's suddenly moving, right? So for a split second, our signal increases because it's not 100% clear at this point, right, if he wants to cross or not. But the moment, so now he steps sideways, you can see our signal drops, and he bends down to pick up something. So it's very clear to humans and our models that he has no intention to cross here, with a little bit of ambiguity, of course. There's sort of a split second. It always looks worse when you slow it down and break it into single frames, but clearly no intention to cross, right? It's clear that he's just bending down to pick up something, but the Voyage car stopped nevertheless, but we could have helped, right, by providing our signals. So how do we look at performance for a system like this? One way of doing it is to use ROC curves, and it typically there's a trade-off between true positive rates and false positive rates, or true negative, false negative, etc. And so the performance is the trade-off between these things in terms of decision making is shown typically in this form. And so the top left represents perfect predictions, right? So if I have a telepathy ray and I can open somebody's brain, a pedestrian's brain, and really measure in that moment what they were really thinking and intending, that's perfect prediction. It's up here, right? But there's no system in the world, of course, that can do this. However, the human brain is exceedingly good at this, and the gold standard for predicting what humans might want to do next and reading all those social cues, right, are clearly humans. We already talked about that at length so far in the presentation. So humans are not perfect though, right? So they're very good at this, but they're not perfect. So there's certain situations where even humans can get it wrong, of course. But this is the sort of the human gold standard, right? So we are today at about 85%, depending on the situation, 85% of human performance, and we're working to close that gap. In some cases, we are much better than that, but I'm giving you sort of the average, right? And of course, we're working hard to improve our models and to make them better and better and close that gap between the human gold standard and us. And other approaches that I've showed you, sort of golden hammer approaches, can help in certain cases, but are very little overall. If you take an aggregate view of, let's say, 1,000, 10,000, a million situations with pedestrians, especially those where it matters. So pedestrians with zero motion near crosswalks or jaywalking, or in busy crowds or city driving, right? Understanding what humans want to do are really important. So other approaches are somewhat better than chance, but only marginally, right? Now, what makes us better than a single human, though, I just want to make that clear, is that our signals reflect the wisdom of crowds, right? So a single intention signal from our SOMI is sort of a distribution of responses from, say, 100 or 1,000 humans, not just one human. And there's clearly benefits to this. Eliminates limitations that an individual might have, a single individual, based on age or eyesight or mental state, etc., right? And we can continuously monitor the environment for all vulnerable road users, not just one. So we have no limitations there. Here's some examples from some of the data that we have. It shows for unsignalized crosswalks where we have pedestrians standing at or near the crosswalk, right? Do they want to cross or not? And it's before body motion, of course, right? Just sort of social cues. And we have very good separation between cross and no cross, even 2 seconds before, right? Before you actually see the crossing behavior, or 3 seconds before, there's clearly a high confidence in our signaling. And of course that increases over time, but just to give you a sense. So this is the kind of data that we can generate to demonstrate the performance of our system. So let me pull all this together into a summary slide. We talked a lot about golden hammer solutions, approaches. So motion is one of them, but let me just take a step back and explain the chart, right? So the holy grail is we can achieve meet our high performance requirements to solve for a problem, but we can also do it as simple as possible, right? So low compute, low sensor requirements, super fast, all those things, right? So simplicity is important. We can't have high performance getting to high performance, but if it requires a time machine, sorry, it's not going to work, right? So there's always this inherent tension between performance and compute performance and sensor capabilities, performance and simplicity. And high simplicity is good, as is high performance, of course, right? And the holy grail will be the top right, where we have high performance and high simplicity. So motion is one of those golden hammer approaches. So if we can see motion, a pedestrian moving towards a crosswalk, continuing to walk through the crosswalk, very simple. AVs can do that today. It's physics-based. We can track pedestrians. No issues there, right? So the motion vector is very simple, relatively speaking, but unfortunately very low performance because it only works in very specific circumstances, typically, let's say, when a pedestrian is already crossing, right? Pose, I showed you pose, which is that stick figure representation of the human body. Not quite as simple as motion, it's more complex, but it does simplify the human body. It isolates arms and legs and heads. So it's not quite as simple, not too complex though, not the most complex. But in terms of performance, again, it can only add value in very specific circumstances. And it has a very limited understanding of situational awareness, for example, as well. And then we have contextual learning, right? So we drive a road a million times and we learn what happens in that road environment. So then we apply those general rules to whatever we see next. It's computationally much more complex, and there's much more work that needs to happen, much more machine learning, etc. So the simplicity is much lower than for pose and motion. And the performance, again, is relatively low. It works in certain situations only, as a general rule, right? And even if we combine the three into one, yes, we can get combined higher performance, but we're making it even more complex, right, in many ways. So it's certainly not going to make it easier or less simple, more simple compared to just a contextual model if we add pose and motion, right? So performance might be higher, but it's certainly not simple. And then, of course, we have the human brain, very high performance and very low simplicity. In fact, it's very complex, right? Complexity is very high. If we could rebuild the human brain and deploy them on all these AVs, awesome, right? That would give us the best performance we can get. But unfortunately, that is not feasible in our lifetimes, almost certainly. So our system combines the best of both worlds, right? So we're able to extract from these human brains the information the human brain uses and then build a model that can get very close to human performance. But it's also very simple and very light and very fast, right? So our SOMI, our models run very efficiently and very lightly. And it's actually, we can build a model using a relatively small amount of data, a good first model that can be deployed and tested. So our solution fits into that top right quadrant, right? It's very unique positioning, and we're not aware of anybody else who can claim to be in that sort of quadrant. I just want to make one thing clear though. We're not claiming to be the only signal that's needed. We are a complementary signal, right? So clearly AVs need to use motion. They need to use pose for certain things. They need to use contextual learning and other techniques. But there is that big missing piece, and our signal complements other signals nicely to provide the AV with a much higher confidence around the driving task, much smoother driving, more natural driving, fewer rear endings, a smoother ride experience for passengers in the robotaxi, right? So there are tremendous benefits there to it, and it's very lightweight. Integration is very simple. We don't replace anything our customers do. So the customers do object detection and tracking already. We plug into that. We take the pixels in the bounding box and feed those into our SOMI. And the output signals, in this case, I showed you pedestrian intent and awareness. We can do other things as well. Those get fed into the prediction and planning modules at the customer end. And that allows them to then, modulate the driving task much more smoothly and in a more confident manner. And by the way, our signal is also another redundant signal, right? So redundancy can increase of lower risk because you have more information. You can trade off, right? You can with an additional independent signal, you can make smarter decisions, lower risk decisions about these things, about the driving task. Quick background: we've raised 20 million in capital so far. These are investors on the top left. This is the founding team, the technical founding team. Sam Anthony is our CTO and co-founder. He has tremendous computer science and cognitive science and behavioral science experience. PhD at Harvard in neuroscience and behavioral sciences. David Cox, who's director of the MIT IBM Watson AI Lab. And then Walter Scherer, who's a very well-known field-leading researcher in computer vision and deep learning. That's the technical founding team. We've been featured in a lot of public publications. Okay, so autonomous vehicles, where next? That's the fourth and final section of my presentation, and I hope to draw on everything that went on before here in the presentation. We're clearly facing massive changes in the automotive industry, and this happened even before COVID-19, right? So we've seen the last 5, 6, 7 years already an increasing pressure on the automotive industry to adapt and change, driven by autonomous, connected technology. So over-the-air updating, connected, wireless connectivity within cars, electrification, of course, and then shared, right? So it's typically referred to as ACEs. Huge pressure on the automotive industry to adapt to this. And it's really been very rapid and profound. And this is sort of, quotes from a couple of years ago from automotive industry leaders. This is not just introducing a new piece of technology or a new feature or a new model or a new concept. This is truly fundamentally profoundly disruptive to automotive. Autonomous, of course, being one of the key drivers for that, right? So the industry was already faced with this. But then, of course, COVID-19 hit. And we already saw a slowdown, by the way, in the last couple of years in terms of automotive sales. COVID-19 hits a couple of months ago, and you can probably imagine that this is a fundamental accelerant, right? An accelerant that will fundamentally change dynamics in mobility, in automotive and autonomous. And you're obviously all facing that and dealing with that in your own lives. So this is a chart that shows some of the projections for volume drops. So on the left here, we have the 2008 and 2009 volume drops when a couple companies went into bankruptcy, automotive companies like GM, FCA Chrysler had to be acquired by Fiat, and they also needed a bailout. But you can see the drop here. It's about 8% over 2 years. Now, the projections for this recession are more in the 20 to 30% range. And we have to see exactly how this unfolds, of course, right? But we've seen a massive shutdown of plants globally. And there's significant differences between today and 2008-9, which was a terrible time for automotive. So again, 2008 and 9, 8, maybe 10% drop. Maybe we're facing at least double this, maybe triple, right, going forward. So a tremendous pressure on the automotive industry. As of mid-May, this is and by the way, this previous chart was from Perla Weinberg Partners. Anthony Schwartz shared this with me. Thank you for that. And this is a McKinsey slide. And as of mid-May, automotive demand down 50% in the US and 80% in Europe. So this is happening, right? It's pretty severe. And so what's happening is that the previous sort of the ACES trend, right, autonomous, connected, electric, and shared, are now being amplified because of COVID-19. But the pressure to invest hundreds of billions of dollars in the coming years haven't gone away, right? So COVID-19 is on top of those existing pressures. And so the automotive industry is truly facing a hugely a profound pressure, profound change probably the worst in 100 years. So that has big consequences, right? So it's useful, as we look at the specific impact, useful to split this into two time horizons. One is so the next couple years, next 2 years, and then the next 100 years. And I know 100 years sounds like a lot, but bear with me on this. So let's focus on the next 2 years. And they're clearly going to be large tactical and operational impacts, right, these next 2 years. First, let's look at automotive. Clearly, this is an example headline. There's going to be accelerated restructuring. We already had sales drops before COVID-19. But the good news is, in a way, automotive companies, and I'm looking for the silver lining here, can now make more decisive decisions that are not possible under normal circumstances, even just before COVID-19. In this sort of environment, you can make more radical decisions. There's a political will to do it, a political understanding. Now it's going to cost jobs, and it's going to be, a lot of negative impact on workers, employees, on towns, cities, and regions, no doubt. But in terms of the long arc of things, right? So, and making sure that companies are able to operate in a healthy manner for the future, they can now make decisions they couldn't have done before. So that is a plus in terms of the long-term viability of the industry and where these companies are going. Clearly, everybody's conserving cash. It's very, very important. The good news is that these car companies were in much better shape from a cash basis compared to 2008 and 2009, and they also have a playbook that they can fall back on to some extent at least. So it's not completely the same sort of shock it was in 08 and 09. Allocation of R&D capital, there's going to be clearly a close look at where this money is being spent now going forward. Should it be less autonomous and more electric? How important is scarce talent? How valuable is that talent to me? Because I need to hold on to talent and incentivize them despite the crisis situation, right? So there's much more of a focus on that. And it also depends on regulatory requirements, right? So there's a lot of pressure on reduced emissions, and there are pretty stringent targets in place in Europe especially. And there is so far no sign that governments are going to relent, but it's still early days, so that might change in the interest of maintaining jobs and buying maybe automotive companies more time to adjust and invest before those regulatory requirements hit them. Make versus buy decisions. Do you make everything in-house, or do you maybe now, instead of taking a risk and building up a team in-house and investing many, many, many millions and tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars, maybe I should go to a team, a vendor or a company or whoever who already has a solution and can provide that solution to me, right? So this environment will probably push decision making more in favor of buy versus make. So there's some real benefits for doing that, of course. And then political pressure, which will continue to increase. Now, autonomous driving specifically is also going to be affected deeply, right? And here's a quote from a typical quote, a stronger quote, but there's similar quotes out there in the press right now, that autonomous is going to be hit hard. So let's look at some of those impacts. So first of all, we already had, because of the 2018-19 sort of hype bubble bursting, there was already a consolidation process in motion. And it's sort of that Cambrian explosion that then led to a proliferation of investments and new companies that now have to be consolidated. And so it's going to be a combination of bankruptcies and acquisitions, and some of those acquisitions will simply be acqui-hires, so acquisition for talent, versus, and some of them will be actual acquisitions, not just for the talent, but also the IP and the software and the solutions that the team developed already. So those are going to be proper acquisitions. For example, do we need 50 LiDAR companies, right? Do we need 3 dozen simulation companies or 50 simulation companies, HD simulation companies for autonomous driving? Probably not, right? But talent still remains scarce. Solving these problems in autonomous are very, very complex, and there are very few people in the world who have that background today. Search for capital. There's going to be some reassessment of spendings and extensions of runways, less hiring. There's going to be investor caution and also departures. But smart capital is going to continue to look for deals. Here's an example, by the way. Zoox, in the information a couple of weeks ago, officially said we're raising money and being much more vocal about it. Zoox was already trying to raise money in the sort of 6 to 12 months or 6 months leading up to COVID-19. So COVID-19 just changes the environment, right, and changes the dynamics and makes this more of a stressful situation. But I do believe that actually in this environment, it is easier for a company like Zoox to message a reduction in valuation to then be able to raise a healthy round. So almost like a reset, right? So just because the valuations went all the way up during boom times doesn't mean that you can then continue to raise money at those high valuations, say a few years later. Now you get into a dilemma at that moment, right? If it's just sort of a slowdown in sentiment and you now unfortunately have to go out and raise money in that environment and suddenly you have to take a hit in valuation, you stick out more. But in this environment, given that everything is getting hammered, if you raise a healthy, good round with good investors at, let's say, 20 to 50% lower valuation, that which might affect the industry right now, then that's much easier to sell, right? Because everybody's affected, and there's going to be more of these sort of announcements, and it's not quite, you just don't stick out quite as much. So there are benefits to this environment in many ways, especially for companies that were already trying to deal with the downward slope in sentiment around this. And again, make versus buy. Instead of doing everything in-house, well, how about licensing or buying from an external supplier, right? And so there's a lot of make versus buy decisions that are probably going to shift in favor of buying. In the past, especially many of the well-funded big guys in the space would try to do everything in-house, and it's possible that there'll be a reassessment of that internally because capital isn't so cheap anymore, and time to market plays a role as well. So if I can pay, let's say, someone like my company, a Perceptive Automata, a license fee to quickly deploy their software in my system, instead of having to in the next month, instead of having to build a team in-house, find tens of millions of dollars, try to research that and build something in-house over the next few years and then hope it works. Or maybe the smarter choice would be to go straight to someone like us. Or if I'm looking for a HD map and I need to replace my own internal HD map, how about I go to, let's say, a deep map and license it from them, right? Instead of trying to do everything in-house. So things are shifting. And then, of course, we're going to see delayed deployments here in the next couple of years. Maybe Waymo, we're going to see Waymo not being so much delayed, given how much they've worked on different things already. But they have Waymo 1 in Phoenix and Chandler as of 2018. So we're going to see a slowdown, and a reset of expectations, but in the next couple of years. But we're going to now look at the long term. So the immediate adjustment to that timeline I showed you here, as we're sort of remember we had that bursting of the hype cycle here as the down point. But COVID-19 certainly pushes timelines out to the right and also makes the drop, the dip, worse, right? So you see that here, hype deflation plus COVID-19, and first deployments, instead of being, say, 2021 or 2022, probably going to be 2023, 4, 25, right? So, and it depends on what part of the world and what company and what ODDs, so operational design domains. So, the more complex environments are going to be later. And when I say first deployments, I don't just mean one little ring-fence sort of deployment that somebody can say is autonomous, but I mean meaningful deployments, right, in multiple cities, et cetera, et cetera. And I probably guesstimate that that's going to be now another year or two delayed, and companies are probably going to use this opportunity to buy themselves more time in this environment, right? Because if you say, hey, we have a 2-year delay, again, you don't stick out as much, and you can actually buy yourself those 2 years, overcome some technical debt, maybe introduce a new sensor generation and do it right. We're still going to have a down cycle again at some point, but who knows what that's going to be. Maybe impatience with the pace of rollout. Okay, but importantly here, I also want to point out that I believe that there won't be any material strategic impact over the longer time horizon, right? So the next 50 to 100 years. There are some powerful fundamental forces that, despite all the hype that we've been dealing with in the last couple of years, the fundamental powerful forces still exist, and those are true and those are real. So let's go through some of those. First, if you think about the impact of tech launch delays, right, and a lot of the hoo-ha right now in the last couple of years was about, oh, it's not going to happen 2020, it's going to happen, a year or two later or 3 years later or whatever. And, Cruise is delayed, right? They announced that they would launch the end of 2019, then they had to push that out. But when you look at some major technology launch dates here, looking back at them, let's assume for a second that Amazon, hadn't launched in 1994, but they had launched in 1995 or 6, or Google launches a year later, or the iPhone launches in 08, 09, not 07. In the grand scheme of things, the impact on today's life would be immaterial, right? Yes, I might not be using my iPhone, 11? I might be using an iPhone 10 still today. But by and large, the long arc of time and long arc of history and the sort of strategic and macro level view of things, a delay in the deployment of a key fundamental technology has very little impact on let's say, quality of life or technology in a way it's used 30 years later, 10 years later, 50 years later, right? So just bear that in mind, a little bit of perspective here on launch delays. Launch delays can sound dramatic in that particular year, but when you look back 10 years from now or 15 years from now, nobody cares. Another way to think about this is, and I alluded to that in the previous slide, a delay can also be positive, especially given the sort of scalability issues and machine learning sort of unique characteristics around machine learning in this space. So you see the green line, that would be the original deployment, let's say 2020 this year, right? Original deployment timelines. And, the AV companies are rolling out their vehicles over the years at this sort of pace. And now we have a delay, let's say 2023. Now, and then you see the blue line here, right? Deploy later. Now, initially, of course, you have the delay and you have fewer vehicles deployed in the first few years. But if you use these 3 years wisely, you can actually accelerate eventually. Now, there's certain things, of course, that underlie this assumption, right? So if you have more time, you hopefully can do things better, because that extra time allows you to improve how scalable you are, so that when you do go and deploy, you can deploy faster and more broadly faster, right? So that's important. Instead of just pushing hard to do things faster and get something out there quickly. So there's a trade-off there. You can in 2023 you can deploy the latest machine learning innovations and techniques compared to, say, today, right? Which should also accelerate you and also maybe improve the safety of the way you're driving and deploying this. And maybe you can go into more operational design domains, right, sooner, because you have better systems. Instead of launching with sensors today, you can launch with later generation compute and sensors a couple of years from now, right? Again, that will help you as you deploy. And then there will be lower sensor and compute costs at launch, right? Like anything, compute costs, sensor costs are coming down steadily, constantly. So compute in 2025 or 2023 will be much cheaper than in today. So again, there's a benefit there. And you've just done more miles, right, so far, both real driven and simulated miles. So maybe you can deploy in broader ODDs, in broader areas more broadly sooner than what you could have done, say, today. There's another big macro trend that is sort of overarching, really, which is software's eating the world. I know you've heard of this before. It's quoted widely, but it's fundamental. And it has huge implications for value generation, talent, and organizational culture. And this is why the automotive industry, right, is going through this profound transformation and profound internal existential threat. It's really difficult for automotive companies to deploy a software development culture and develop a software development culture internally, because software, unfortunately, up until just very recently, has always been sort of a side thing, right? Sort of a firmware for a piece of ECU or something like that, and it was handled by tier one suppliers, and it was software developed just to enable a piece of hardware and maybe enable some communication between different pieces. But there was never really a competitive software development culture at these companies. So they're certainly trying to catch up in that area too, and doing making tremendous investments in that. So this is an example. For example, Volkswagen, Herbert Diess is doing a tremendous job, really sort of pushing Volkswagen forward. Setting strategic goals, putting capital behind this. So Volkswagen is rebuilding or building for the first time, pulling together different software groups that they had in different units, different divisions, and also at suppliers, and pulling them together into one big centralized unit, and also hiring new people and building out new facilities, and really trying to transform software development at Volkswagen and make that core to the company, and do it more in sort of a Silicon Valley way, to attract also the right kind of talent. Also, keep in mind that the harm, societal benefits and societal benefits from accidents, human caused accidents, are huge, right? Globally, valued, one way of valuing this sort of at roughly $3 trillion a year. About 200 million vehicles are damaged every year, 50 million people are injured, 1.4 million people are killed every year. It's the number one killer for people 29 years or younger, and 95% are due to human error. Right? And when we look at specifically the younger generation, some very shocking statistics. We kind of know this, but when you see the numbers, it's pretty shocking. Teenagers just simply don't have. I mean, we in this country we let them drive at 15, 16, but they're really not quite ready for that. They're very inexperienced. They have underdeveloped brains, especially as it relates to risk assessment and executive function. The brain doesn't mature in that sense until 20, 21, 22, etc. So this is a big issue, right? So if we could have autonomous vehicles drive up teenagers around safely, then that would be a big plus. Same for elderly drivers, right? They struggle with driving. And then just some of the key human factors that cause crashes. Texting, 25% of crashes. Drowsiness, 25% of crashes. And speeding, about 35% of crashes. So that's a huge part of that 95% of human error. So it's $3 trillion in damage there. AVs can affect and improve traffic flow. So I'm going to run this.
In 2008, an experiment was conducted in Japan in which people were asked to drive at 25 miles an hour in a circle. A simple task, you would think. But what you see happening after a few seconds is a collapse of traffic because humans are not able to maintain distances. This is the cause of a lot of energy inefficiency in traffic. 10 years later, a Cal grad, Denmark, did this experiment. The Arrow is a self-driving vehicle. Right now, the car is just driven by a human, and you can see after a while, the same oscillations happened. Now we're going to engage the autopilot. Okay, now it's self-driving, and what do you see? Suddenly, things smooth out. 42% energy savings with that algorithm. And that's an interesting paradigm because this is the beginning of a new era. Now, let's do 2 lanes. You can see this guy is behaving kind of like a jerk, right? It's switching lanes to prevent people from passing. But it actually stops the problem. The computer learned to do it with machine learning in a few minutes. And you could argue, well, what's the big deal? You learned this in police academy, right? Okay, now try this one. So now, what did the computer learn? It learned to create a snake. It learned to do it without any model. It's just artificial intelligence. Now this, I can't tell you what it's doing anymore. It sometimes will hold cars, sometimes it will let them go, but I can't even rationalize what it came up with. But you look at the numbers, it's actually more efficient. So where are we going with this? What about the Bay Bridge? There's right now a big metering light that prevents cars from entering. What if instead you had self-driving car holding the flow so it flows smoothly? This is a reality we will collectively experience within less than 10 years guaranteed.
Here's Alex Bayan at UC Berkeley. Very, very interesting, just to give you a sense for what might be possible, right, when we have AVs deployed at scale and being able to communicate and manage traffic flows. Parking spaces, right? The hope is that once AVs are deployed at scale and we've gone through a transition period, that we can reduce the number of empty parking spaces in this country, right? Tremendous amount of surface area being used for that, for parking lots everywhere. Changes in society are actually profound, right? So we're already seeing, if we look back over the last 35 years or so, there's been a 31% drop in per capita vehicle sales, which is very interesting. The country has grown, here in the US, of course, our population's been growing pretty significantly over the decades. But when you look at the per capita numbers, actually, and then that's why vehicle sales have been relatively healthy as well. But when you look at the per capita numbers, clearly a downward trend. People are urbanizing. There's more of a sharing economy here in the last 5, 6, 7, 10 years. The ability to communicate using social media reduces the need to travel somewhere and meet with somebody. And then, of course, we have baby boomers retiring in larger numbers. And then there's sort of the value of time lost while driving and commuting. Yes, driving can be fun, and I also like to drive at times, but by and large, driving is a pain for most people, and most people actually don't like it, and they're commuting and they're stuck in traffic trying to get to work or from work, or going home from work, or going to soccer practice or whatever, right? So one way of estimating this here, and this is Larry Burns, and also some numbers from Brad Templeton. So, about 2 to 4 trillion per year in the US could be freed up if we had autonomous vehicles dealing with these or driving us around, right? There's a lot of value that we can extract from that. Again, trillions of dollars. I'm going to skip this. You can maybe go back to this later when you replay this. But social isolation is a huge issue for the elderly and the blind and individuals that are just simply socially isolated because of ailments and other restrictions. And so apparently, I wasn't aware of this until recently, the likelihood of survival can be impacted by as much as 50%. Those that comparing those that are socially isolated versus those that are that have strong relationships, and this is a huge number in my mind. So, AVs can certainly improve the mobility for, say, the visually impaired, and it's a big benefit. The market for autonomous vehicles, autonomous technology is very large, right? We always talk about robotaxi typically because that's in everybody's sort of public consciousness, but there's last mile delivery, there's warehouse delivery, there's automated trucking, there's travel applications, shuttle services, mass transit can also be automated, right? There are lots of different applications, and you see some of that here in this wheel. And when we look at the robotaxi application as an example, according to various estimates out there, the costs are maybe up to 10 times lower than, say, a typical taxi or an Uber, right? So this is a huge cost saving. So think of Travis Kalanick and his reaction in 2014-15 to aggressively build up a self-driving team at Uber. This is triggered partly by this, right? So if Waymo can launch a robotaxi service at much lower cost points than Uber ever could because they have human drivers, then that would rapidly put Uber out of business. Some estimates for the cost reduction for last mile delivery, if you take the human driver out of it, 10 to 20x. Big savings, right? Think of all your Amazon deliveries at home. Then here's some market size estimates from various sources. Perella Weinberg did a good job at summarizing that. We're talking hundreds of billions of dollars, again, trillions of dollars in market opportunities, depending on, pace of rollout, et cetera, and what kind of application. But these are huge numbers. So what the OEMs realized, right, and in 2014, 15, 16, is that they're only sort of making a cent per mile when they sell a car, roughly. But there's a huge opportunity to make much, much more than that in sort of new mobility services, right? We're talking trillions. And you either want to play in this little pool over here, or you want to play in this big pool over here. And it's an obvious way that automotive companies can extend and expand, and they need to play in that. Otherwise, they just become suppliers of vehicles, shells and engines and metal, but don't really control mobility services where the big money is being made. Right. This is Chris Urmson making a statement about the size of the industry, comparing it to the advertising industry. Another interesting perspective on this, describing how big the opportunity is, the long-term market opportunity for this. So if we pull all this together, this is, potentially a $10 trillion opportunity, and a combination of revenues that can be made from business investments and mobility services, time saved, commuting, the time value of the value of time, basically, right, converted into dollars, saving lives and reducing vehicle damage, et cetera, reducing insurance costs. We're talking trillions and trillions of dollars globally. And okay, so let's maybe we disagree on half of that. That's still 5 trillion. Or even if it's only a couple trillion, that's huge. Even that should incentivize us to believe in this technology and where it can make a big difference. So this is happening. Let's have a look though at some of the claims out there that AV tech is simply too costly to develop and deploy. So let's do a quick experiment here. So these are some numbers from the information, and it summarizes the investments or spending so far by some of the leading autonomous driving companies. And it's roughly up to, we're now at sort of $1 billion at scale, $1 billion of annual development spending. So Waymo, for example, and Cruise. The smaller players are not spending that much. They're spending maybe half that. But to really get to a point where we can develop this technology sufficiently to deploy eventually, let's assume it's $1 billion a year, right? So we can take that number and make some additional assumptions about launch year. For example, here I assume 2023 in one city, rolling out to 100 by 2030, making some assumptions about how many autonomous vehicles we deploy in a typical city, how much they cost, making assumptions about cost reductions of those autonomous vehicles, the hardware and compute and sensors over the years, and then make some assumptions about the gross profit rate per autonomous vehicle, and model that out. And you can see here the blue curve is the cumulative spend, but then the green curve is the net one, right? Because as we're rolling out, we're already making money. So yes, I have to spend initially so the following year I'll be rolling out. Let's say this year I roll out to one city, so then I make money on that one city next year. But the following next year I roll out to 2 cities or 5 cities, and so yes, I have to keep spending initially, right, ahead of the curve, but I'm also beginning to make money as I roll out. So the green line is really sort of the capital requirements, the net capital requirements or cash flow requirements. So in the initial few years when we're still developing, right, it's $1 billion a year. And then when we start launching in 2023, let's be more pessimistic. If you look at the numbers, it's about 1.4, 1.6, 1.9. Let's assume it's $2 billion starting 2023 through 2028 or 2030, right? In terms of making this technology happen. Each of these investors has typically the big ones, 3 to 5 key owners and investors with deep pockets, and we'll get to that in a minute. So it ends up being about $500 million, $500 million per year, per owner and per investor over those years. Now, clearly $500 million per year sounds like a lot of money, and it clearly is a lot of money. But in the scheme of things, if you think back to the $10 trillion prize and the trillions of dollars available to us and the fundamental enabling technology that this is, and if I can be a part owner in that for the long term, for the next 50 to 100 years, I can have a nice ROI on that, right? So $500 million for a big investor who's committed to that long-term prize isn't actually that much money. And now when we look at specifically the sources of cash or sources of funding, let's compare that 500 million to some of the spending that's already gone on, right? So this is a list from Bloomberg showing what the OEMs have already spent on AV technology to date, right? In the billions. Investors have poured 220 billion into auto tech investments so far, and 100 billion up to 2016, and then 120 billion after. Again, $200 billion in the last 10 years. That's 20 billion a year roughly into auto technology, right? So again, 20 billion versus $500 million. That's sort of what we're talking about here, the value, right? Cash on hand, automotive companies have, and these are Ford, Toyota, Honda, General Motors, for example, anywhere between 20 and 55 billion in cash. Now, they need a lot of that cash to deal with the COVID-19 implications, of course, in the next few years. There's no doubt about that. And cash is king right now. But when you look back at sort of the 08, 09 Great Recession, even then, automotive companies had a pretty surprisingly healthy amount of cash available, right, in the 20 to 50 billion range, 20 to 40 billion. So $500 million is not that crazy a number if you need to invest that on an annual basis. Let's have another look at additional sources of funding. So I summarized 4 key players here. Waymo's has committed capital of $7 billion. These are the key investors in Waymo, the big ones. Take a look at the Canada Pension Plan, right? $400 billion in assets. Mubadala, the Abu Dhabi Sovereign Wealth Fund, $200 billion, $225 billion. Google, $100 billion in cash, $120 billion. T. Rowe Price manages $1.3 trillion. Fidelity Management manages $7 trillion. Now, I'm not saying 7 trillion, 1.3 trillion are available for investment. But my point is, there are liquidity is not an issue out there. There are large entities that have capital available to pay for, $500 million a year over 10 years if they have to make this a reality, because the ROI is tremendous. Cruise, $7 billion. SoftBank, $100 billion in fund size. T. Rowe Price, again, Honda and GM investing, Argo, right, Ford and Volkswagen. I have a feeling that we're going to see some bigger investments for Argo soon, similar to some of these investors up here for Waymo. And then Aurora, which is Chris Urmson's company. Amazon invested in the last round. Again, Canada Pension Plan invested. They also invested in Waymo. Bale Gifford, they're a UK-based or European-based fund manager, and Hyundai, the car company. So, these guys have deep pockets. They don't want to waste money, but $500 million for one of these guys a year isn't that much. It is absolutely doable. And even more, there are many more like that, right? So if you look at the world's pension and sovereign wealth funds and add them all up, it's about $10 trillion in funds. And they all need to invest money, right? So there's a lot of liquidity in the world, and they need to put money to work. They need to justify. They can't just sit on cash, even in this environment. So we have here the Mubadala, Abu Dhabi Investment Authority. Mubadala is part of this, so they have 225 billion. Abu Dhabi as a total group has almost 700 billion, and down here is Canada Pension. And you can see there are, dozens and dozens of investors like this, sovereign wealth funds and pension funds. And again, we're looking at 10 trillion in assets. Let's look at private equity firms. There's Silver Lake here, Waymo Investor. Again, this is just one of 300. There are, funds, companies bigger than Silver Lake, and many that the same size, right? So there is a massive amount of capital available. I don't think investing in this space is too expensive, or developing this technology is too expensive, and it will make money. There's an ROI for it. Okay, so there is another issue here, right? So one is, one way of thinking about this is, how do we get to L4, L5? How do we get to fully autonomous driving? And there are sort of two general paths. Right? One is we start with level 4, level 5, like a Waymo, and just focus on that and skip levels 1, 2, and 3. So you can see here, level automation 1, 2, and 3. Level 3 is now increasingly recognized and widely seen as a sort of a death zone almost, because the automation is too good, so that humans basically don't pay attention anymore, but the technology can't be good enough to deal with all circumstances. So, but then when the system detects these circumstances and the human driver has to take over, it's impossible for them to do so. The human brain can't switch on fast enough, right? So there's this sort of valley of death, I guess we can call it. Maybe sounds a little too harsh, but it is that, right? It could be extremely dangerous for human drivers. So the Waymos of the world, and Cruise and Argo and Aurora, start up there at level 4, level 5, and they're developing today. They're at the sort of dev fleet and limited ODD sort of stage, roughly here, and mass deployment will be 2030, hopefully, but there'll be deployment, of course, before that, right? We're going to see rollout of this technology in the coming years, but in terms of mass deployment in many, 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 many different cities around the world or regions, it'll take probably 10 more years. But and that's sort of this crew. And then we have the traditional ADAS route, so which is sort of technology, automation technology that in cars today that enable level 1 and level 2 type functionality. And some players until very recently tried to place bets on this. And the idea was, hey, we're going to keep investing in ADAS, and eventually we're going to get there, right? We're going to get through this zone, and we're going to get to the same end goal that Waymo is aiming for, right? Which is fully deployed L4, L5. The difference is that, of course, ADAS technology is already deployed today. So they're not sort of dreaming up something completely new, but they can build on incrementally on what exists today. Now, the challenge with that is that it's very, very difficult to extend ADAS technology through L3 into L4. And here's a quote that talks about sort of the issues around human awareness. And so level 3 in its pure form will probably never happen. I think there's sort of a very recent realization that it's not going to happen. So the investment has to go into L4, L5 type technology. ADAS technology investment will continue for the time being, of course. There's additional value that we can get as consumers from ADAS, L1, L2, or maybe L2 plus. But in terms of the long-term game, right, it's shifting more into L4, L5 going forward. I'm going to skip this, but this is Actually, no, let me run this. This is way more
First guy
experience.
Seems to be doing some texting. There's another fellow who's insisting that he needs to get some charge in his cell phone.
It's John Kravchik at Waymo.
Maybe it's charge in his laptop.
Narrating, not in the car.
This woman thought it essential and imperative to put makeup on during the rush hour. Not a best practice. But what really pushed us over the line was this last video. It's a little hard to see here, but this last guy was so out of the loop that he actually fell asleep at about 100 kilometers per hour down the expressway in the morning.
Right, so this is the issue with level 3 type driving. It's too good. It's good enough for humans to sort of take their eyes and brains off the road and do other things. But it's not good enough to deal safely with all situations. And human handover can take many seconds. It's amazing how long it takes for the human brain to suddenly re-engage and gain enough situational awareness to react to danger. And so, these technologies are fundamentally different. ADAS and full self-driving are very different in the same way that propeller technology is very different from jet engine technology, or coal power from solar power, or ICE technology from electrification, right? EVs. So very different. You can't extend propeller technology to as far as jet engine technology capabilities, right? You can't. If you want to do something fundamentally new, you need to rethink it from the ground up. It's a very different way of solving a problem, different types of compute, different algorithms, different talent, different ways of solving problems, right? So very different. So there's another powerful motivator that is going to keep driving investment in autonomous driving, and that's this existential threat from Waymo, right? So or from anybody who is first to develop this technology, because they will be able to generate a lot of value and control the user experience in the future, right? So if I'm selling BMWs or whatever, right, or I'm selling Audis or I'm selling Fords, and I suddenly have a Waymo who has a fully self-driving system, a driver basically, right, and I don't have one, then I just become a supplier of vehicles, and the real value added, the thing that people are paying for and the services that can be delivered using that autonomous driver are not under my control. I'm not sharing in that. I'm not benefiting from that, right? So there's an existential threat. Waymo can put Uber out of business. It can diminish the margins and for all the automotive manufacturers, right? So there's and delivery companies. There's an existential threat for these companies. So they need alternatives in the market. They know it can't just be Waymo. That's why you're partly seeing why all these big companies are cutting partnership deals with multiple different companies and players in the space to place multiple bets, because nobody really knows what's going to come of this. So there are two strategic actions, right, that these players are taking. One, actively support one or more of Waymo's full stack competitors with capital, assets, know-how, operational support. And you saw some of the investments, for example, Volkswagen in Argo, or Honda in Cruise, or it's probably both, leverage best-in-class specialized teams in the AV ecosystem, right? So they're the full-stack players, and then there's sort of the, I don't know, maybe we call them slice players, right? So there's companies like DeepMap that focus on HD mapping, and there's companies like ours here, Perceptive Automata, that are focusing on the human behavior prediction slice. And we're developing solutions for different slices of that stack. So partnering and licensing and acquiring and collaborating in that way is another way to accelerate development, or to increase the likelihood that you as OEM A, B, C, D, or ride-hailing company A, B, C, D, will have an alternative solution. So it's not just Waymo, not just Waymo and Cruise, or not just Waymo, Cruise and Argo or Aurora, but there are more options out there. So it creates optionality, which is really important. One of those fundamental principles in if you're negotiating big deals, right? Optionality is very important. And here's an example of that. The reason, if you remember, why BMW, Daimler, and Audi purchased HERE maps from Nokia in 2015 is because they said, look, we need to have an alternative. We can't just rely on Google Maps, for example, to do the mapping for us, because Google is getting better and better at mapping, and they have the resources and capital. They're going to start dominating our software, right, in our cars, and the driving experience, and then of course autonomous driving as well. So their goal was to transform HERE Maps and own it and transform it into a mapping company that doesn't just do navigation mapping, but can do mapping for, let's say, L2, L3 type automation, in the same way that Super Cruise is using HD maps or semi HD maps. They're better than navigation maps, but not quite as good as L4 HD maps. And then also have HERE Maps then develop full HD maps for L4, L5. That was the vision. That's the goal. A reason why they invested like this. So there's lots of examples like this. So I hope that sort of convinces you that the automation train has left the station. This is happening. This is Jim Farley, who's one of the leaders at Ford. Electrification is going to be huge. I think that's a tremendous plus for us as a society. It's going to reshape a lot of value in the value system. But autonomous is just as important as well, and what that can enable. And once that kicks in, and once that launches, and once it's ready, the transformation can happen actually quickly. We're thinking, in this environment, it's going to take a long time, it will never happen, all those sort of the general sentiment right now. But keep in mind that transformations can happen really quickly. And I love this sort of this slide and the next slide. This is from Tony Seba at Rethink X. If you haven't seen his presentation yet, you should quickly check it out and watch it. It's absolutely worth watching. His vision of the future on transportation, and how quickly technology is replacing new technology, replacing existing technology, and what's going to happen to oil and autonomous and electrification, all that. You should watch that. You can find it online. So here's an image from his presentation, and he says, where's the car? Okay, so obviously this is New York City in 1900, and there's one car there in orange, right? 13 years later, only 13 years later, where's the horse, right? Same road, same area, one horse. The rest, automotive cars, right, and vehicles. The transformation even 100 years ago was rapid. So it is not inconceivable that autonomous driving software and technology can rapidly impact and transform mobility and our built environments, and certainly roll out faster than we think. Bear that in mind. And just circling back to those consumer surveys I showed you earlier on, first of all, actually having 50% of people that want to ride in autonomous, or I'm not against riding, or would be interested in riding in autonomous vehicles, that's actually a really good number, even if it's only 10-20%. But these are some of the reactions when cars were first deployed, vehicles were first deployed 100 years ago. Lots of drama around this and fear. So this is not new, right? And we had the same sort of sentiment at the introduction of microwave ovens, mobile phones, electricity and lighting in houses. There was lots of drama around all of that as well, and fear. Now, of course, we have to make sure this is safe technology, right? Nobody's saying it should be laissez-faire and we should just throw this out there and fears are not unfounded. We have to absolutely make sure that this technology is safe. And I know most of the teams and leadership that at these different companies that are working on this, including the team here at Perceptive, everybody is generally working on the right things, trying to do this the right way and safe way. And the downside is obviously too enormous to not do it this way. These teams are doing everything humanly possible to develop this technology in the safest possible way. And once it's deployed, it will be deployed safely There will be accidents. It can't be avoided. Any new technology, no new technology is completely 100%, foolproof. But as a society, there's tremendous benefits in deploying this technology, right? And we make this sort of trade-off all the time when we deploy new technology, or we give 16-year-old, teenagers driving licenses, because there's a trade-off. They're more mobile. They can do things. They can help. They can go shopping, right? So there's reasons for why we as a society decided to give teenagers driving licenses, because there's an upside and a downside to anything, and that's a sort of a decision we have to make as a society. So in summary, every automotive OEM supplier and ride-hailing company needs a seat on this train, right? And I believe patient capital will place smart bets. This train has left the station. It will arrive. It's fueled by powerful long-term forces. The next couple of years are going to be bumpy, maybe very painfully for some, and we're going to see a shakeout in the AV ecosystem. Some companies will not survive. We're going to see consolidation. We're going to see drops in valuations. But the trillion-dollar long-term value proposition for this technology has not changed. It's going to impact so many different aspects of driving, of value creation, saving lives, societal benefits, right, of isolation, reducing isolation of the immobile, things like that. Recovering some of the time we lose to commuting and being stuck in traffic. Every one of these large, key players in the world, in ride-hailing or automotive or trucking or delivery, transportation, logistics, everybody needs a solution to this. And this is why, by the way, also Amazon is very active in this space and might actually acquire Zoox to build a full self-driving team, and it can't just be Waymo, right? Everybody needs to make sure that there are as many successful full stack players as possible. So, because competition gives leverage in negotiations, and I believe that the sort of main, I call them Silicon Valley AV full stack developers, will come out of this stronger. Even some of them will have some pain in the near term, but it sharpens the mind, and the smart money will double down. I think more smart money will come in and invest. Even, let's say, a full stack developer in Silicon Valley, one of the big names, might not quite get the same valuation they were hoping to get maybe 2 years ago, a year ago. But even then, right, it's going to be a successful win-win investment for both sides. So investors get a lower valuation than they would have got otherwise, and they can be part of that long-term prize and the upside. Patient capital will place smart bets, and there are huge amounts of capital that are looking for investments. We went through that whole list, and assets are cheaper, and new innovations are typically ignored when we project ahead. This includes machine learning breakthroughs that are still to come, sensor compute breakthroughs, and cost reductions. So don't make predictions based on what you know today. You have to assume that the inevitable constant innovation around software, machine learning, AI, sensors, compute will continue relentlessly, and the world will have very different tools in 2025 than today. And it will have, this technology will have a material, strategic, and tactical impact even well before we see broad-scale deployment, right? So the decisions that are being made today by OEMs, let's say, spending billions of dollars on new initiatives and autonomous, impact decisions that smart young talent makes about where they want to work, right? So do you want to work in an old industry where maybe a traditional player isn't quite sort of managing to catch up? Or do you want to try and join one of these Silicon Valley companies, right? Masters of AI and the tremendous resources and the culture that these companies have. So people are already making decisions today based on what is coming down the road in the coming years, or even 10 years from now, in the same way that investors are placing bets today, and stock market valuations are impacted by that long-term view. So bear that in mind. Decisions are being made today already. We don't have to wait for broad rollout and widespread adoption of this technology. So putting this all together, I'm going to rotate this line up. I showed it to you earlier. So there is this. Yes, we have ups and downs. Yes, we're impacted by COVID-19. Yes, some of the deployments, widespread deployments, are uncertain in terms of the specific year, but it is happening. The line is pointing upwards. It's exciting. It remains as exciting today as it has been the last 5, 6, 7, 10 years, 15 years. This train will continue. Again, short-term adjustment, short-term pain, but I believe that the industry will come out of this stronger than it was, say, last year. And finally, maybe one final silver lining, because COVID-19 might deliver another payoff, a long-term payoff. So we might have a baby boom starting here in about 7 to 8 months from now, which leads to more robotaxi passengers in 2035 onwards, maybe, right? And then more need for autonomous trucking and last mile delivery and more warehouse robots. So more people, more demand, more business. Okay, thank you very much for your time, and wish everyone all the best. Happy to address any questions anyone has. You can follow up with me personally as well, of course, via LinkedIn or email. Reach out if you want. Thank you very much.